5. The last Heinkel. Throughout World War II, the British shot down a large number of German bombers. But these wrecks remain curiously absent from the landscape today. Most of the destroyed planes ended up in the water surrounding the British Isles, where they occasionally reappear. One of the only 2 remaining German wrecks that can be found on land in the United Kingdom is a rare Heinkel He 111 that sits on a remote landmass in northern Scotland's Shetland Islands. Known as Fair Isle, it's Britain's most isolated inhabited island, with a population of just 48 residents. Today, it's one of those blink and you miss it type of places. But during the war, it was home to an important Royal Air Force radar station, and the Shetlands served as a vital outpost to the British war effort. Using specifically modified bombers, German pilots routinely flew over the area to collect information that could be used for their own purposes. They also occasionally attacked Fair Isle and other military locations throughout the region. On January 17, 1941, the Heinkel 111 was shot down during a routine weather reconnaissance mission. It crash-landed at Wasseter, killing 2 of its crew members. 3 surviving crew members were promptly put under citizen's arrest by residents who lived nearby. 2 days later, and after multiple failed attempts to reach Fair Isle, an RAF mission arrived and took the prisoners to Shetland. The plane's pilot, Heinz Thurs, survived the accident, which happened on his 21st birthday. During the late 1980s, he returned to the site where he met with some of the locals who were present at the time of the crash. As of 2007, both of Heinkel's engines remained at the crash site, along with a large section of its tail and fuselage. 4. EgyptAir 990. EgyptAir Flight 990 provided regular passenger service from Los Angeles International Airport to Cairo, with a stop at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. During the early morning hours of Halloween on October 31, 1999, a Boeing 767 that was flying the route inexplicably crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 60 miles south of Nantucket Island off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. All 217 passengers and crew members perished, making it the deadliest EgyptAir accident of all time, and the second deadliest crash involving a 767 aircraft. The plane had taken off from JFK at 1:20 in the morning. At 1:44 a.m., it reached its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. 4 minutes later, the captain, veteran pilot Ahmed El Habashi, went to use the restroom. During his short time away from the cockpit, both of the engine's throttles were moved to idle. The aircraft quickly entered an increasingly steep dive, causing a feeling of weightlessness throughout the cabin and undoubtedly sending the passengers into a sheer panic. Despite the chaos, Captain El Habashi managed to re-enter the cockpit. As he struggled to regain control of the plane, it reached its maximum descent rate of 39,000 feet per minute, bringing it dangerously close to breaking the sound barrier and pushing the 767's frame far past its design limits. For reasons that remain unclear to this day, the Relief First Officer, Gamil al-Batouti, cut off the fuel supply to the plane's engines. A few moments later, Captain El-Habashi pushed both throttles to their maximum position, but with no fuel supply, his efforts were futile. He managed to slow the plane's dive using the speed brakes, but the electric went out, causing the flight recorders to stop recording. Investigators were forced to rely on radar data and the distribution of wreckage to figure out what happened next. Based on the limited information available, they learned that the plane entered a steep climb for about 40 seconds, most likely as a result of the crew's attempts to pull the 767 out of the dive. After ascending from 16,000 feet to 25,000 feet, the plane entered another steep dive, one that the crew was unable to recover from. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board and the Egyptian Ministry of Aviation's Egyptian Civil Aviation Agency both struggled to come up with an explanation for the crash, which happened during a non-critical part of the flight that appeared to be going normally until it suddenly began plummeting toward the ocean. As far as anyone could tell, nothing was mechanically wrong with the plane. The NTSB concluded that the first relief officer Gamil al-Batouti's flight control inputs caused the crash. But the why part of the case remains unexplained to this day. In its report, the agency did not rule out the possibility that al-Batouti deliberately crashed the plane. The ECAA denied that this was the case. But the truth is that nobody knows what was going on in Albatuti's mind. Any reasons he may have had for causing the plane to malfunction, whether deliberate or unintentional, were taken with the pilot to his watery grave. Hey, real quick, we just wanted to say thanks for watching American Eye. Let us know in the comments what else you'd like to learn about, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 3. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. On October 13, 1972, 19 rugby players boarded a chartered plane in the Uruguayan capital of Montevideo, with 21 family members and friends for a game in Santiago, Chile. When the flight failed to reach its destination on time, authorities launched a search. The effort was called off after 8 days. It would later be discovered that searchers had flown over it multiple times without noticing it. 72 days later, a pair of survivors approached some herdsmen in a remote region of the Andes and asked for help. They had trekked 38 miles on foot from the wreck site. Once authorities were notified, they sprang into action to plot a rescue plan. Over the following 2 days, they saved 14 more survivors from the crash site. Officials were shocked to learn that the plane had turned for its final descent 40 miles before it was supposed to. It struck a mountain in the eastern Andes, causing its wings and tail to shear off before the fuselage barreled down the slope at 220 miles per hour. It eventually came to rest along the mountainside at an elevation of 11,710 feet. 12 people died immediately. The survivors struggled to stay warm in the fuselage while awaiting rescue that never came. Over the following days and weeks, many more succumbed to their injuries and the brutal cold. By the time authorities called off the search 8 days later, they had completely run out of food. They tried to eat leather and cotton from the plane's seats, but it made them sick. The ensuing discussions could likely be described as being beyond most people's worst nightmare. After multiple heated disagreements about how to stay alive, the remaining survivors finally agreed that if they died, it was appropriate for the others to eat their body in order to avoid starving to death. As you can imagine, they were horrified by the mere thought, but their only choices were to die or eat their dead. By the time help came nearly 2.5 months later, 13 more people had died in addition to the 12 who perished in the crash. Authorities burned the fuselage and buried the deceased at the site in a mass grave, which is marked by a plaque and a cross to memorialize the lives lost. But the burning question of why the plane turned when it wasn't supposed to lingered. An investigation ultimately concluded that an inexperienced co-pilot was at the controls when he mistakenly turned for the aircraft's final descent long before he should have. 2. Philippine Air Force C-130 crash. On July 4, 2021, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules took off from the Philippine city of Cagayan de Oro with 104 members of the country's Air Force and 5 military vehicles on board. While attempting to land at Jolo Airport in the province of Sulu at 11:30 that morning, the plane overshot the runway. It crashed into a nearby wooded area and burst into flames, prompting a military search that was carried out with the assistance of local residents who immediately sprang into action to help after witnessing the collision. 50 military personnel perished in the crash, including the pilot, along with 3 civilians on the ground, making it the Philippine Air Force's deadliest aviation accident of all time and the country's worst air disaster in 30 years. It took more than 2 months for authorities to identify all the victims. 46 of the aircraft's occupants survived with injuries, along with 4 civilians on the ground. Most of the personnel on the plane were recent Air Force graduates who were on their way to participate in counterinsurgency operations against Abu Sayyaf, an Islamic separatist group based in and around the city of Jolo. Witnesses reported seeing people jumping out of the aircraft before it hit the ground, but it's unclear whether the decision spared them from the deadly blaze or cost them their lives. Horrifying photos of the wreck that appeared in the news showed the mangled C-130 in pieces and engulfed in flames while thick black smoke rose above the surrounding coconut palms. Based on the imagery and word of mouth, rumors circulated rapidly in the initial aftermath of the crash. Despite caution by the Philippine Department of National Defense, and the military against jumping to conclusions and spreading potentially false information while an investigation was carried out. After ruling out the possibility of an attack by another aircraft, but still lacking definitive answers, investigators retrieved the plane's flight recorder and voice cockpit recorder and sent them to experts in the United States for analysis. The findings failed to pinpoint a single cause for the crash, which is pretty rare in an era of advanced technology, and considering the intensive scrutiny that follows when an air disaster occurs almost anywhere throughout the world. A report by the Armed Forces of the Philippines blamed a combination of material, human, and environmental factors. The explanation is somewhat vague, stating that the crash was most probably due to actual or perceived material factors and induced human factors which were aggravated by local and environmental conditions. In simple terms, the findings speculate that the crew's response to these actual or perceived factors caused the plane to stall irreversibly. Exactly what those factors may have been remains a mystery to this day. 1. BSAA Star Tiger. After World War II, passenger air travel skyrocketed. To accommodate the growing number of commercial travelers, numerous British bombers were hastily converted into passenger airliners. Included among them was a Lancaster bomber with the gun turrets removed, known as the Avro Tudor 4. On the morning of January 28, 1948, 25 passengers and 6 crew members were forced to wait at the airport in Lisbon, Portugal, for 2.5 hours when one of these planes, dubbed the Star Tiger, ran into some engine trouble. The aircraft was scheduled to travel to Bermuda following a 75-minute refueling stop in the Azores, but was further delayed at Santa Maria when the captain, Brian W. McMillan, decided that the weather was too poor to continue on to the final destination. He decided to wait until the next day. The weather was still inclement the next morning, but after being delayed for more than a day, McMillan decided to take off for Bermuda despite strong winds. To avoid getting caught up in the worst of it, he flew no higher than 2,000 feet and kept in regular contact with another pilot who had flown out an hour ahead and agreed to provide weather updates. The Star Tiger was lashed by heavy winds and rain, but the flight seemed to go as planned for the first 10 hours. When McMillan realized that the wind had blown the plane about 60 miles off course, it was past the point of no alternative, which means that there was no closer airport to divert to if something went wrong. In other words, the crew had no choice but to continue on toward Bermuda. McMillan followed the navigator's instructions, which sent the Star Tiger directly into a gale, but should have enabled it to land at its destination with at least an hour's worth of fuel remaining. Captain Frank Griffin, the pilot of the plane that flew out ahead of the Star Tiger, landed in Bermuda without encountering any major turbulence, icing, electrical storms, or other weather-related problems. But McMillan went radio silent, and the Star Tiger was never seen or heard from again. An intensive 5-day search amid worsening weather failed to turn up any sign of the aircraft. While it's pretty obvious that the plane crashed, its whereabouts and the reason for the accident remain a mystery to this day. Even if one of the aircraft's engines had failed, it should have been able to reach Bermuda. An investigation concluded that a mechanical failure was unlikely to be the cause for the disaster. It's possible that flying into a gale caused the plane to consume more fuel than expected, even after factoring in the weather, causing it to run out of fuel and plunge into the Atlantic. Investigators have also suggested that the crew may have forgotten they were flying at a low altitude and may have miscalculated their descent, especially if they were fatigued. This could have also easily caused the plane to crash. Around the time the Star Tiger should have been approaching Bermuda, the captain of a merchant ship reported seeing a low-flying plane with blinking lights halfway between Bermuda and Delaware Bay. This raises the troubling possibility that the plane was much further off course than its crew realized. And of course, there are theories about the aircraft falling victim to the alleged supernatural powers of the Bermuda Triangle. But the only certainty about the missing flight is that nobody knows what happened to it or where it ended up, leaving the Star Tiger's fate shrouded in mystery to this day. USS Massachusetts. For over a century, a decommissioned battleship known as the USS Massachusetts, or BB-2, has rested on the seafloor near the mouth of Pensacola Bay. Managed by the state of Florida, it now functions as an artificial marine reef and scuba diving attraction. It's reportedly considered the oldest battleship still in existence. But the Massachusetts is likely doing more good as a wreck sitting on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean than it ever did as an actual battleship. Constructed in Philadelphia during the late 19th century, in what's known as the pre-dreadnought era, the USS Massachusetts belonged to the Indiana class of vessels. It was the second ship in the United States Navy to rival foreign battleships of that time, and it was built as part of a naval modernization initiative, alongside her sister ships, the USS Indiana and the USS Oregon. Measuring 351 feet in length, the Massachusetts was relatively small for a battleship. However, it compensated for its size with substantial armor and weaponry, generating considerable anticipation upon its unveiling. A crowd of 15,000 gathered to watch as the ship was launched in 1893. The Massachusetts was then commissioned 3 years later in 1896. But what seemed like the start of a promising career on the high seas proved to be more problematic than anything, earning her the nickname of the worst battleship ever built. The early years. During the initial 2 years of its service, the USS Massachusetts primarily operated along the east coast of the United States, with a significant portion of that time spent conducting training maneuvers off the coast of Florida. In late March of 1898, just before the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, the ship was deployed to Hampton Roads, Virginia, where it joined the renowned naval force known as the Flying Squadron. The squadron proceeded to the Caribbean, where it enforced a blockade on Spanish vessels near the southern coast of Cuba, specifically around the city of Santiago. This blockade commenced in early June and lasted approximately 1 month. On the night of July 2nd, the Massachusetts, along with 2 other vessels, departed from the blockade to sail to Guantanamo for refueling. Unfortunately, though, this timing caused the ship to miss the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, in which the Spanish fleet unsuccessfully attempted to break through the blockade. After briefly returning to Santiago, the Massachusetts proceeded to Puerto Rico, where it supported the American occupation of the island for about a month before returning to the United States. Upon arriving at New York Harbor, the ship underwent a brief overhaul. However, during its departure from New York, the Massachusetts struck a sandbar called Diamond Reef, resulting in flooding in multiple forward compartments. Following necessary repairs, the vessel resumed service along the East Coast as part of the North Atlantic Squadron. Ironically, in 1901, the Massachusetts ran aground once again off the coast of Pensacola, Florida, not far from its eventual resting place. And 2 years later, in 1903, a turret explosion occurred during target practice, resulting in the deaths of 9 crew members. This incident marked the first fatalities on a U.S. battleship since the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898. Just a few months later, in August 1903, the Massachusetts ran aground a 3rd time in Frenchman Bay, Maine, sustaining significant damage and requiring extensive repairs. These incidents represent only a fraction of the challenges the ship faced throughout its controversial career. And although some of these events could be attributed to bad luck, the vessel was fundamentally flawed from the start due to design weaknesses, rendering it highly susceptible to problems at sea. A powerful but problematic punch. The USS Massachusetts was protected by armored sides made of solid steel measuring 5 inches thick at the waterline. It was equipped with 4 guns weighing 136,000 pounds each, amounting to a combined total of 544,000 pounds. They were the largest guns ever put to sea at the time, and were capable of shooting projectiles weighing as much as 1,130 pounds at a distance of up to 2 miles. And with all the other guns on the ship factored in, their combined weight exceeded 1,000,000 pounds. However, despite its durability, firepower, and grandeur, the USS Massachusetts suffered from significant design flaws. One of the ship's biggest flaws was its weight, particularly the tendency of the gun turrets to cause severe listing when pointed in the same direction. This issue often resulted in parts of the ship, including some of its guns, submerging underwater. In addition to the guns being woefully overweight, they required hundreds of thousands of pounds of ammunition, further adding to the ship's already substantial weight. The Massachusetts' massive coal-fired engines were fueled by 1 million pounds of coal, and the weight of the 475-man crew and their supplies also added to the problem. Weight wasn't the vessel's only problem, though. Its solid steel armor was placed too low, which meant that it failed to protect most of the ship. And below the waterline, the hull was entirely unarmored, making it extremely vulnerable to collisions and enemy fire. Whose fault was it? Some naval historians attribute the flaws of the USS Massachusetts to the designers attempting to incorporate too much weight and too many guns on a vessel that couldn't adequately support them. However, journalist Ben Raines of AL.com suggests that the ship's flaws were the result of a political compromise. In 1890, several years prior to the construction of the Massachusetts, the Secretary of the Navy requested approximately $300 million from Congress, equivalent to about $6 billion in modern funds, to build a fleet of 35 battleships and 167 smaller vessels. But Congress responded with a firm no, driven by various reasons. While some politicians were alarmed by the high cost, others believed that constructing such a large battleship fleet would convey a message of the United States aspiring to become an imperial world power, rather than focusing on the more honorable goal of defending national interests. At the time, the United States adhered strictly to isolationism, a policy aimed at minimizing involvement in foreign affairs. A year after rejecting the proposal, Congress approved $4 million in funding for 3 ships: the Massachusetts, the Indiana, and the Oregon. In present-day currency, the $12 million price tag would amount to approximately $240 million in funding. Following the principles of isolationism, the ships were intended solely for coastal defense, and therefore they weren't designed as superior seafaring vessels. The plan called for moderate endurance and relatively small displacement. However, as history shows, the Massachusetts and its sister ships turned out to be excessively heavy and self-defeating in their intended purpose. This can be partly attributed to the fact that the trio of ships were primarily designed by military officials rather than engineers or naval architects. Specifically, the Massachusetts was based on a modified design for a short-range battleship formulated by a policy board in 1889. The ship's designers were focused on arming the vessels, but unfortunately failed to consider their seaworthiness. Their priority was to pack a significant punch rather than ensuring realistic design considerations. And these costly oversights became evident as soon as the ships were launched. Just a few years after their launch, the Massachusetts, the Indiana, and the Oregon were already considered obsolete, leading to their early retirement in 1906. If you designed a battleship, what would you call it? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, subscribe. Redeeming qualities and lessons learned. The Massachusetts, Indiana, and Oregon may appear to have been a considerable waste of resources, but these ships did achieve some notable accomplishments during their service. The Massachusetts earned recognition for its role in the U.S. victory during the Spanish-American War. Although it missed the decisive Battle of Santiago de Cuba, its contribution to the blockade was regarded as valuable to the American war effort. Despite being overshadowed, the Massachusetts' failures taught the Navy important lessons, including the significance of counterweights in the construction of ships with large guns. After the vessels were initially retired in 1906, the military took the necessary steps to improve their performance by adding appropriate counterweights. And as a result, the vessels were utilized for training new recruits, even during World War I. The Massachusetts underwent extensive repairs and was recommissioned in 1910, shortly after the Secretary of the Navy declared the ship and its sister vessels as worthless and obsolete. It was decommissioned again in 1914, but re-entered service for a final time in mid-1917, a few months after the United States entered the war. From June 1917 to May 1918, the Naval Reserve employed the Massachusetts for gunnery training in Block Island Sound, along the American East Coast. The ship then moved to Chesapeake Bay, where it served as a heavy gun target for practice until the end of the war, after which it returned to Philadelphia. On March 31, 1919, the ship was decommissioned for the last time, and it was redesignated as Coastal Battleship No. 2. This was done to allow the name Massachusetts to be used for the newer South Dakota-class dreadnought battleship designated BB-54. In November 1920, BB-2 was struck from the Naval Register and given to the U.S. Department of War for target practice with experimental artillery. Then, on January 6, 1921, the former Massachusetts was intentionally scuttled at its final resting place near Pensacola. It was sunk through the use of railway artillery and the coastal batteries at nearby Fort Pickens. In early 1925, the War Department officially returned the wreck to the U.S. Navy. And while offers were made to purchase the wreck for scrap, none met the desired bid, leaving the damaged ship with an uncertain fate. Eventually, though, the Supreme Court of Florida declared the Massachusetts wreck as state property, and in June 1993, a century after its ill-fated launch, the wreck site became Florida's fourth underwater archaeological preserve. Then, in 2001, the site was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Today, the wreck serves as an artificial marine reef and a popular diving destination, demonstrating that even flawed military creations can find new purpose. Resting in just 30 feet of water, the scuttled ship sometimes protrudes above the surface, allowing visitors to catch a glimpse of the historic vessel. The Indiana and Oregon. Similar to the Massachusetts, the USS Indiana also participated in the blockade of Cuba during the Spanish-American War. It underwent multiple cycles of decommissioning and recommissioning, being decommissioned in 1906, recommissioned in 1910, decommissioned again in 1914, and recommissioned for a second time in 1917. It was then finally decommissioned for the last time after World War I. Following its permanent retirement in 1919, the Indiana, also known as BB-1, was renamed Coastal Battleship No. 1 to allow for the reuse of the name Indiana for a newer naval vessel. In early 1919, it was towed to the shallow waters of the Chesapeake Bay, where it was utilized for naval aerial bombing tests, which involved weapons experiments and target practice. And as anticipated, the Indiana sank during these tests and remained at the wreck site for the following 5 years until it was sold for scrap in early 1924. The USS Oregon, designated BB-3, also served in the Spanish-American War. After the conflict, it was deployed to the Philippines and joined the Navy's Asiatic Squadron, participating in the Philippine-American War. During this period, it contributed to the blockade of Manila and Lingayen Gulf, as well as supporting the capture of the city of Vigan. The Oregon was decommissioned in 1906, but returned to service a few years before World War I. After a brief period in the reserve fleet, it was fully reinstated in 1917. Although it didn't engage in actual combat, the ship played a significant role during the war as an escort for troop transport vessels. It was officially struck from the Naval Register in 1942, following an unsuccessful preservation campaign, and eventually it was sold for scrap. However, it was reclaimed by the military in 1943 and was stationed in Guam, where it served as an ammunition storage facility for several years after the war. But then, in 1948, the Oregon disappeared during a typhoon. It was eventually found, though, drifting 580 miles southeast of Guam. It was towed back to the island and remained there until 1956, when it was purchased for its parts. But the ship changed hands multiple times before being sold to a Japanese company. It was then towed to Japan, where it was dismantled with only a few pieces of it saved. At the moment, the Oregon's mast can be seen at the Tom McCall Waterfront Park in Portland, while its wheel is in the possession of the Oregon Historical Society. 9. Infrared security. The White House is equipped with all the common-sense security features one would expect, including bulletproof windows, a fence, and alarms, as well as armed guards. But there are also a number of heightened security measures, including highly sensitive infrared lasers that detect even the slightest sign of a potential threat in or around the building, including underground and in the sky. The system picks up on even the slightest changes in temperature, and it alerts security to any potential threats. There's also a roof-mounted radar that monitors for any flight activity within the 15-mile flight-restricted zone surrounding the White House. and in the event that someone flies into the zone. There are a number of strategically placed surface-to-air missiles throughout Washington, D.C. that are capable of intercepting unauthorized aircraft. 8. Super secure fencing. One of the White House's more visible security features is the 10.8-foot-tall, wrought iron perimeter fence that surrounds the 18-acre property. It looks like a normal fence, but it's likely the most secure fence in America. Perched atop crash-resistant concrete footings and topped with barbs to prevent anyone from climbing over, it's also equipped with sensors that detect any signs of pressure being applied to the bars. The first White House fence was commissioned around 1801 by Thomas Jefferson. By 1808, he replaced the original wooden post and rail structure with a stone wall. There was also a ha-ha wall, which was built into the ground to prevent cattle from grazing into the garden while offering an uninterrupted view of the grounds. The White House upgraded to wrought iron fencing between 1818 and 1833. In the years since, the fence has been updated, expanded, and replaced to accommodate the property's need for increased security and protection. Different parts of the White House grounds were opened and closed to visitors over the years, depending on President's wishes, the Secret Service's recommendations, and the state of national security at any given time. Construction on a new perimeter fence began in 2019, with a projected completion date in 2023. The new barrier will consist of 3,500 feet of steel fencing, with wider and stronger posts, and the height of the fence is being increased to 13 feet. Much like the structure it's replacing, it's equipped with anti-climb and intrusion detection technology. 7. A drone security breach inspired the use of security drones. An off-duty government employee exposed a major White House security fault in 2015 when he flew his recreational drone onto the property at 3 o'clock in the morning without triggering its radar detection system. The operator lost control of the drone, causing it to crash into a tree and alerting Secret Services officers to its presence. Measuring roughly 2 feet in diameter and weighing less than 2 pounds, the drone was too small and was flying too low to be detected by radar. Ironically, the incident happened just days after the Department of Homeland Security addressed concerns about the dangers posed by drones during a meeting in Virginia. Officials were particularly worried about the possibility of someone flying a drone with explosives attached to it onto the White House and other government properties, as well as the potential for drones to be used for launching chemical and biological attacks. Since then, the White House has implemented its own collection of security drones, which function as moving security cameras and are equipped to take down intruding drones should the need arise. 6. It's supposedly haunted. Like many historic buildings, the White House is rumored to be haunted. 10 people have died on the property, including Presidents William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, 3 First Ladies, and Abraham Lincoln's son, Willie. Abraham Lincoln claimed that he received regular visits from his son's ghost. The president's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, said that she saw Willie's spirit standing at the foot of her bed. And while Honest Abe himself did not pass away in the White House, legend holds that his ghost roams the property, with most reported sightings occurring in the Lincoln bedroom and the Yellow Oval Room. White House doorman Jerry Smith was the first to report seeing Lincoln's ghost in 1903, when he told a newspaper about the encounter. Several notable figures have also claimed to see Lincoln's ghost, including Lady Grace Coolidge, World War II-era British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. Legend also has it that the iconic president's spirit visits the White House whenever the country is in peril. He's often seen wandering listlessly down the second-floor hallways and lingering near windows. Not all of the White House's ghosts are seen. Some resident spirits are infamous for making noise. Harry Truman was awoken late at night to the distinct sound of someone knocking on his bedroom door. After double-checking to make sure nobody was in any of the surrounding rooms, he locked his door and went back to bed. He then heard footsteps coming from a neighboring room. Truman was so spooked by the incident that he asked around to see if any Secret Service staff members had been in the house. He was told that nobody would have been in that part of the White House, especially at that hour of the night. One of the property's most famous ghosts is David Burns, the landowner who sold the property the White House was built on to the U.S. government. He seems to hang around mostly in the Oval Office, where several presidents claim to hear the man's voice. People have also claimed to hear the famously foul-mouthed President Andrew Jackson's ghost swearing. And Thomas Jefferson's spirit is known to occasionally give a violin performance. Do you believe the White House could be haunted? Let us know in the comments, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. There's an underground tunnel system and a secret entrance. In the event that the president and his top aides need to flee the White House, rather than hunker down in an underground bunker, there's an underground tunnel system below the building. At least 2 of the tunnels lead to locations off the property, with one connecting to the Federal Treasury Building, and a street-level entrance hidden in plain sight. Located on H Street, the entrance was built during the 1940s. At one end of the route, there's a closed-off alleyway equipped with a ram-proof gate. The alley leads to a rear doorway of the Treasury Department's annex on Pennsylvania Avenue, which connects to an underground passageway leading directly into the White House basement. Measuring 761 feet long, 7 feet high, and 10 feet wide. The tunnel is built in a zigzag pattern to mitigate the effects of a direct bomb hit. The passageway is lined with several small rooms that once contained cots, in case the space needed to be used as an emergency bunker. According to former White House Military Office Chief Bill Gully, male staffers snuck their mistresses into the mansion through the tunnels during the Johnson and Carter administrations. 4. It's a lot bigger than most people realize. From the time President John Adams became its first resident in 1800 until shortly after the Civil War, the White House was the biggest home in the United States. Even by modern standards, it's an extremely large residence, boasting 55,000 square feet of living space across its 6 floors. It has 132 rooms, including 35 bathrooms, as well as 8 staircases, 3 elevators, and 28 fireplaces. The building that most people recognize at the White House is also known as the Executive Residence. Consisting of 4 floors and a 2-story sub-basement, it's where the president and his family live, and it also contains rooms for entertaining and hosting official ceremonies. The executive residence is flanked by an east and west wing, which are connected to the central structure via 2 colonnades. Most official business is conducted in the West Wing, which houses the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, a meeting space known as the Roosevelt Room, and a small theater known as the James S. Brandy Press Briefing Room. The West Wing is also home to a highly secure ground floor intelligence center called the Situation Room. The 2-story East Wing houses the visitors' entrance. Built in 1942 to hide the construction of the nearby underground Presidential Emergency Operations Center bunker, some First Ladies have used it to house their offices and staff. The 18-acre property surrounding the White House boasts a golf course, swimming pool, tennis court, and a jogging track. 3. There's an in-house dentist and medical clinic. The White House's sub-basement and mezzanine levels house the property's air conditioning, heating, electrical, and other utility systems. The floors also contain storage space, elevator machinery rooms, a laundry room, a carpenter's shop, a floral shop, an engineer's shop, and an area for storing flatware and dishware. These areas essentially function as the White House's nerve center, and are where employees can be found doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes work that keeps the property's operations running smoothly. Given the sub-basement and mezzanine's uses, the president and his top aides don't spend much time on these floors. But the commander-in-chief might venture down to the basement if he cracks a tooth or needs a routine cleaning. Installed during the Hoover administration in the 1930s, the White House Dental Clinic was originally very basic. Today it houses state-of-the-art equipment and an operating space. The basement also contains a medical clinic as well as a 2-lane bowling alley, which was opened in 1947 during the Truman presidency. Its construction was funded by Truman supporters, and while the president himself didn't use the bowling alley very often, he gave his blessing when employees decided to form a White House bowling league in 1950. 2. The British almost burned it down. During the War of 1812, British forces became the first and only foreign power to ever capture and occupy Washington, D.C. The siege was carried out in retaliation for U.S. soldiers looting and burning the British-held city of York in Ontario, Canada. After setting the U.S. Capitol building ablaze, British troops proceeded to the White House. By then President John Madison and most government officials had fled the city. As the encroaching force approached, First Lady Dolly Madison made a last-minute attempt to save some of the White House's valuables from being destroyed or falling into British hands. A doorkeeper and gardener were ultimately credited with saving an iconic painting of George Washington, known as the Lansdowne Portrait. The invading troops entered the White House to find that a lavish feast had been prepared. Dolly had ordered the staff to prepare the regularly scheduled meal for 40 top staffers, apparently unaware of the impending violence until right before it hit the fan. After helping themselves to the food, the British set fire to the White House. To ensure maximum damage, they returned later on and added more fuel to the flames. The entire inside of the White House was essentially gutted by the fire, with the Lansdowne portrait being the only item that was saved. Today, it hangs in the building's East Room. If you know where to look, you can see some of the fire damage, including some blackened stones near the mansion's north portico, where an entrance once stood. 1. There's an emergency bunker. Located underground beneath the east wing of the White House, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, or PEOC, is a shelter and communication center for the president's use during emergencies. It was built during World War II to protect then-President Franklin D. Roosevelt from potential aerial attacks on Washington, D.C. The PEOC is staffed by military officers and equipped with televisions, phones, and other communications equipment. It was built to withstand a nuclear blast and is accessed via an elevator located behind multiple highly secure vault-like doors. The bunker is basic but highly secure. It reportedly consists of a command room with a large conference table that can seat up to 16 people, a small briefing area, an operations and communications room, and a hallway lined with cots. In the event of a White House security breach, including when an unauthorized aircraft enters Washington, D.C.'s no-fly zone, the president and their top aides are relocated from their offices to the PEOC. Whenever this happens, a specialized Army engineering unit remains on standby in case the need arises to dig the occupants out of the bunker. Former President George W. Bush and several White House officials retreated to the PEOC after the 9/11 attacks on New York City's Twin Towers in 2001. After realizing that the bunker was woefully under-equipped, the government updated the PEOC to better serve the staff's needs. In 2020, President Donald Trump utilized the space during protests that followed the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer in Minnesota. When people began noticing a secretive construction project being carried out on the White House grounds in 2010, many speculated that the PEOC was undergoing a major upgrade, or that an entirely new bunker was being built. The government claimed that the project was a utility systems upgrade, but the amount of building materials that disappeared into the ground and the barriers that were built to block the view of the site suggested that a much bigger effort was underway. According to author Ronald Kessler, who wrote about the project in his 2018 book, The Trump White House: Changing the Rules of the Game, the new bunker is 5 stories deep and is equipped with its own air supply and stocked with months' worth of food. Little else is known about the rumored shelter, which is reportedly unstaffed and reserved for use in the most extreme of national security emergencies. Thanks for watching. Did you know any of this information before watching this video? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.